Hello, Dr. Ken Gillman here. This is another talk a little bit about features on the website, the odds and ends menu, which has got all sorts of bits and pieces on it, as I mentioned in the first section introducing this. So this is the second talk about the odds and ends menu. And I want to touch on what I've written about Freud. As most people who know a little about my writing will know, I'm not a specialist in psychological aspects of psychiatry. I'm a psychopharmacologist. But nevertheless, understanding what happened with the whole story about Freud, I think is very, very important. And in a way, this is a little relevant to the other menu, Bias in Science, which one of these other talks will give a bit of an introduction to. Because Freud is an extraordinary example of a distorting influence in some aspects of psychiatric history and practice. And so I couldn't resist writing a little bit about him, because as is so often the case with biographies of famous figures in history, it's amazing how long it takes for all the different elements of the story to be revealed and a more comprehensive and accurate picture to emerge. And I think that's the case with Freud. And I only became aware, perhaps 10 or 15 years ago or whatever, of the extraordinary amount of material that had emerged about Freud, which indicated very strongly, I try never to say proved, but certainly indicated very, very strongly that he manipulated the case histories and the stories he told in the most extraordinary way. I think by modern standards he would be considered a dishonest scientist. Well, he wasn't a scientist, but a dishonest person who deliberately misrepresented the cases that he talked about in a way which was almost certainly geared to boost his ego and make himself famous. One of the famous historians who wrote about Freud described him as being more like Walter Mitty than a scientist. And I think in many ways that's got a lot of evidence to support it. I mean, in his early career, when he was very interested in cocaine, which he took regularly and was addicted to, this historian described how he obviously thought that his ideas about cocaine that he was trying to publish were going to make him as famous as Darwin. Now, considering the fact that he didn't really have much of a track record in academia, almost negligible track record of any significant work or publications of any sort, and he hadn't really held much of a post, to have had ideas like that was quite extraordinarily out of proportion to reality. I mean, fantasy. So I can sympathise with this historian who described him as being more like Walter Mitty. And I think it was some years, of course, before he started producing his ideas about psychoanalysis. And he clearly was very driven and had a very great need to attain some kind of notoriety. Well, of course, that's not a very firm ground for being honest and objective. And so it's not surprising that evidence has emerged that he was neither of those things in a big way. He certainly was a rather odd fellow. But from a scientific point of view, I think that what the story illustrates is how he ignored the basic tenets of good scientific observation. And for those that are interested in this kind of thing, the commentary goes into a reasonable amount of detail about all of that sort of thing and the hijinks that he got up to, and so on and so on. It's a long and interesting story about which much has been written. And connected with that Freud story and its theme of how the methodology of science that's aimed at avoiding these observational errors and distortions that Freud was so prone to. The other commentary that deals with that is called How Your Mind Works, It's Magic. And that's got a few different themes in it. One of them being to do with how Freud's legacy of things like repressed memories and all that sort of nonsense has had a very destructive legacy in modern medicine. You know, people think that it's only drugs that cause side effects, but incorrect psychological ideas cause adverse effects that are just as bad. And if you don't believe that, you only have to look at all the murderers that are on death row and have been released as a result of new forensic evidence that were condemned by eyewitness testimony, and even worse, all of the parents who've suffered through the legal system and even being sent to jail, especially in North America, in other places too, but perhaps worse in North America, because of all this repressed memory nonsense, where children have been interviewed by these psychoanalytically orientated therapists who claim to dig out repressed memories of sexual interference and heaven knows what else, and so on and so on. And judges have been persuaded to accept this ridiculous evidence that's totally uncorroborated. And these poor people have finished up in jail. There have been huge numbers of cases like this all over the world in the last 2 or 3 decades, I suppose, now. I don't think the problem has completely gone away now, but I think at least in most jurisdictions people realise that kind of thing is nonsense and can't be relied on, can't be used to find people guilty of such offences. And other aspects of that, how your mind works, its magic, look into how magic tricks help us to understand how the brain works. I'll give you a brief example of that, just to illustrate how fascinating it is and how sobering it is to realise how limited our brains are in some ways. They're brilliant in some ways and limited in others. And that is this: your vision. You're convinced that you see the whole world around you in full panoramic colour. Well, let me explain something about your eyesight. Your retina, which the fovea is the sensitive central part of your retina. The fovea has, whatever it is, 90% of all the photoreceptors in the eye, and yet it represents 1% of the total area of the retina. The rest of the receptors are distributed around the rest of the retina, and in fact most of those receptors give you something a little bit closer to black and white vision rather than full colour vision. So really full colour vision as you think you have it really only occurs in that central area of the fovea. So how on earth do you see everything around you in full colour all the time? Well, the answer is, of course, you don't. your brain tells you you do, but that's not what you're actually seeing. Is just an area about the size of the end of your thumb, held at arm's length, in full colour. The rest of it is in closer to black and white and much less detail. So really, if you were seeing, what you really are seeing, understand it, then it would be more like a burglar going round a more or less dark room with a little pencil flashlight, and you'd just be seeing those bits of the room that the flashlight lights up. So your brain does this extraordinary feat of convincing you that you see everything in full colour. There's a limit to how much information you can absorb. Some of you will remember the early days of satellite phones, when news reports used to contain a picture of somebody giving an account from a distant place, and you'd notice that their head, lips, seemed to move normally. Well, that of course was because they produced clever computer algorithms that made you think as though you were looking at a face, because what you mainly look at is people's lips moving and whatever, and not refresh. And so of course that occasionally suddenly jerk about because you weren't getting a proper continuous picture. Well, that's an analogy, if you like, for what your brain's doing, but your brain fills in the gaps so well you don't notice it. So I hope you will find that commentary on how your mind works its magic helps you to understand a bit better an array of different aspects of how your senses work and how your memory works, and how faulty that can be, and how your memory is not as reliable as you might imagine it is. Read and enjoy.